Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final event of JCC of Metro Detroit's 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair Festival Week. My name is Brenda Brook, and I'm chair of the Book Fair Committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Sunday evening to our closing night featuring Gary Shteyngart. This is the 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair, and we're celebrating with an entire year of book and story programming. So join us as we honor the world's first Jewish book fair, highlighting diverse authors, curating new Jewish writing, and promoting the global art of Jewish storytelling. Our festival, which began November 6th, is just the beginning this year. We hope you'll join us all year long for exceptional opportunities to engage with the best of Jewish books and Jewish authors. To see our full event schedule, watch all the events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can buy Our Country Friends and many others. Visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. And if you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. And you can do either of these at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. Remember that we rely on community support to make this annual event possible. So please contribute, and I thank you in advance for becoming part of our family. The Book Fair team would like to thank our co-sponsors tonight, Doris and Frederick Bleckman, for their support. But I also want to extend my deepest gratitude to the whole Book Fair committee and the professional staff and our technical staff. Without their dedication, innovation, commitment, and hard work, none of this could have been possible. We have a captivating discussion for you this evening, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below, or by texting to the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they'll take as many of your questions as they can. And remember, while you're at this YouTube channel, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. And that way, you'll never miss any of our events. The focus of tonight's event is the new novel, Our Country Friends. And we have with us the author of the book, Gary Shteyngart, as well as author and editor, David Ebershoff, who will moderate the discussion. Our Country Friends is set in March of 2020. A calamity is unfolding as a group of friends and friends of friends gather in a country house to wait out the pandemic. In a remarkable literary feat, Gary Shteyngart has documented, through fiction, the emotional toll of our recent times, a story of love and friendship that reads like a great Russian novel set in upstate New York. And be sure to check out today's New York Times book review for a glowing review of Our Country Friends. Gary Shteyngart immigrated with his family to the United States from the Soviet Union as a child, an experience that has influenced much of his writing. His work has received numerous awards, including the National Jewish Book Award. And in addition to fiction and memoir, Gary Steyngart's writing has also appeared in The New Yorker, Slate, Granada, Travel and Leisure, and the New York Times. David Ebershoff is a vice president and executive editor at Hogarth Books and Random House. His novel, The Danish Girl, was adapted into an Oscar-winning film, and his #1 bestseller, The 19th Wife, was adapted into a television movie. He is a self-proclaimed word nerd. So please join me in welcoming Gary Shteyngart and David Ebershoff.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Gary, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, David. How are you?
I'm good. Congratulations. We have a lot to celebrate. As Brenda mentioned, you're on the cover of the New York Times Book Review today. You're also an instant New York Times bestseller with your new novel, Our Country Friends. I thought a place to start, Gary, would be go back in time.
Yes.
In late February 2020, it probably was the 27th or 28th of February. You and I had dinner in Greenwich Village at a quintessential Greenwich Village restaurant. It is the size of a very small studio apartment. The tables are like super close to each other.
Yes.
And we were having a glorious dinner out with our neighbors breathing on us and us breathing on them. And you and I talked about the virus as if it wasn't coming for us.
Yeah.
And we also talked about something else. We talked about the novel you were writing at the time, which was a dystopian novel set in the 90s.
Yeah.
And then we said goodbye and we went away. And in November of 2020, not that long after, you texted me and said you were turning in your new novel. But it wasn't the novel you talked about at all at that dinner.
Yeah.
It was Our Country Friends. So can you tell us the origin of the book and what happened in that time period for you?
Absolutely. And it's great to be here. I miss Detroit a lot. I remember being at this book fair for my novel Super Sad True Love Story and having a wonderful time in that beautiful part of America. So hopefully soon I will see you live, but wonderful to be here virtually. Yes, so I remember that dinner very well. And I think a week or two before that, a friend of mine had come in from Milan, which was then the epicenter, which became later the epicenter of the virus. But I remember he said, I have a little cold, but let me give you a hug, and I was thinking, sure. I mean, he's Italian. That's how we do. We hug. But of course, a month later, I remember I was working on that novel I was telling you about. And the funny thing about that novel was that it was kind of a delightful little dystopian novel. It was set partly in a future where NYU, New York University, controls all of Manhattan, has its own police force. So it was kind of a satire in academia in a way. And it was very cute, but all of a sudden, a real dystopia was overtaking us. The pandemic, by early March, mid-March, I began to realize that this thing wasn't going to go away. Now, I have a kind of premonition for these things, having been born in a disastrous part of the world, the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union. I'm what you call a SAP, a Soviet Ashkenazi pessimist. For me, the glass isn't even half full. There's no glass at all. So I thought, this pandemic isn't going to go away anytime soon. There's not going to be a political will to get rid of it anytime soon. I know my new country. I understand how America works. I understand the kind of people that were in power at that point. So I began to shift my attention to maybe writing about the current disaster. Now, at the time, so I spent about 60% of my time in upstate New York, where I have a country home, a little bit like the one that the protagonist of this book, Sasha Senderovsky, has. Sasha has 5 little cabins for all his friends. I have just one little guest house, so it's not quite the same setup, but I have a little house, and I always invite my friends from New York up there. It's kind of like a urban fresh funds, that thing that people have, right? But I was up there for most of the pandemic with my wife and my child, my 8-year-old kid. So as I was up there, I said, okay, I don't have a novel to write because the novel I was writing no longer really makes any sense. I don't know what other activity to engage in. Everyone around me was baking bread, but I have no idea how to bake bread or do anything like that. I don't have any skills. People were carpenting and trying to build stuff. I'm just this guy. So I was reading a lot of Chekhov at the time, and I'm so happy that so many reviews caught on to the fact that there's some very Chekhovian stuff going on. And so I began to read in Russian and then in English as well, a lot of Chekhov stories, of course, also the plays like Cherry Orchard. Uncle Vanya was especially helpful. All these novels, all these plays and short stories about people living in the countryside and being somewhat dissatisfied with their lives as they hit their 40s or beyond. So there's a lot of reminiscing and nostalgia. Oh boy, if only I'd fallen in love or done this or that. So that was sort of what was going on in my mind. And then I thought, well, since I'm stuck here in the pandemic, I have this Russian country flavor happening in my life. Why don't I try writing a novel about it? And that's what Our Country Friends, the book, and then Our Country Friends, the Riesling began. And I know You have
the Pinot Noir.
You have the Pinot Noir. So,
right.
It's a book, it's a wine, it's many things. Maybe more merchandising will come, but cheers to that. Yeah.
Cheers to you in the book, and thanks to Millbrook Winery in upstate New York, who supplied us with this wine. And I want to mention that we're really happy to take questions from the audience. So if you put those in the comments, we'll see them and incorporate them into the conversation. So don't be shy. Gary, one of the things that one of the reasons I really love the book is, although it is set during the first many months of the pandemic, that is the context, but not really the story. It's really about friendship, love, betrayal, family, but friends especially. It's in the title, Our Country Friends.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, this group of friends gathers upstate at Senderovsky's home, his little dacha on the Hudson.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about who Senderovsky is, and then who gathers with him?
Sure. So Senderovsky is sort of my avatar, if you will. He's a Russian novelist. He loves living upstate because, just like me, I used to go to a Russian bungalow colony across the river. I'm sort of in the Rhinebeck area where the book is set, but I used to go in Ellenville in the Catskill Mountains. There was this kind of Russian Jewish colony. And when I moved to America, I didn't speak any English, and all the kids made fun of me, and I was wearing a big fur hat and the big fur coats, and a lot of woodland animals died from my attire. But I would go upstate, and the kids there were my fellow Russian Jews. We didn't speak English that well. We were learning. We were trying to figure out who Cyndi Lauper was and all that kind of stuff. And to me, that was like heaven. That was the summer. We spent all of summer there with our babushkas, and we would just sit around eating ridiculous Russian food, but also very much bonding with each other. And these were my first true friends, my first true loves. So Sasha, like me, has that house upstate as a way of remembering and paying respect to that part of his assimilation into America. Now, his wife is Masha, who is a psychiatrist who deals primarily with elderly Soviet Jews who are all sort of into QAnon and all these very far right things, as many older Soviet Jews are, all these strange conspiracy theories and stuff. So she's sort of a psychiatrist to them. And they have a daughter named Natasha. So there's Sasha, Masha, and Natasha. And Natasha likes to go by Nat. She's very precocious. She loves this Korean pop band called BTS, which is now the big band out there. And she's very sort of exploring her identity, which is still very much in flux. And the people they invite are Sasha's two best friends. So there's Vinod Mehta, who's from Gujarat in India, and he's kind of also a failing novelist. His career never really took off. And then his best friend, Karen Cho, who is the owner of $1 billion+ app, which makes people fall in love with one another. It's called True Emotions. It's this new app she's developed. And then there's Dee, who is a young Southern essayist who is all over the place. She's supposedly liberal, but she also flirts with the far right. She is trying very desperately to stay relevant. And finally, into this mix comes this hand grenade of a man called the Actor. That's how we refer to him throughout most of the book. And he is just the sexiest, hottest actor out there. Women just swoon over him. Men swoon over him. You can't not swoon over this guy, but he's a little bit of a jerk. But throughout the novel, he develops many love triangles in a very Tolstoyan way with a lot of the inhabitants of Senderovsky's little estate. So the book sort of goes through all these different permutations of love. But going back to what you were saying, yeah, this is my first novel where friendship is at the very top of the agenda. I would say that my first few novels, which, it reminds me of, some of my favorite Jewish novelists are the Roths, Henry Roth from the early 20th century. And I teach his book at Columbia, call it Sleep. And it was all about the immigrant experience. And I think, and also Philip Roth, who also, wasn't an immigrant, but his grandparents were. So he constantly wrote about the sort of incestuous nature of these small groups, in America. And so that was my MO as well. My first couple of books, including my memoir, were mostly about my relationship with my parents, which is complicated, at times difficult, at times lovely. But I think in this book, because the characters are all in their 40s, they can't really look back at their parents as the main part of their lives anymore. Some of their parents have passed.
Right.
Some of their parents are in lovely Florida or somewhere else. So but at the other hand, they have internalized their parents, as we all do. So that by the time you're in your 40s, your character is pretty much set, and you've already absorbed so much of your parents. You've filtered some of it out through friendships and psychotherapy and all that good stuff, drinking. So these are the characters that are sort of set at this point, and their interaction, the fact that many of them go back decades to high school. They all went to this math and science high school. For those who know New York, it's Stuyvesant High School, which is also where I went. And it's interesting, there was actually a study that's quoted in the book about the friendships that formed in the 80s and 90s between Soviet Jewish, Korean, Indian, and West African immigrants. We were all kind of thrown into the same melting pot together. And that is one of the important threads, I think, of the book.
Yeah, in some ways, all the characters come from someplace else, and it's a very important theme of the book. I'd love you to just expand a little bit on that, like what that means by putting this particular group of characters into this pressure cooker of this colony upstate during the pressure cooker of the pandemic.
Well, I know that I only have a family of 3 people, myself, my wife, and my kid. And even that we got along very well. And we were lucky enough to be in a large house with a large land around us and beautiful nature and a pool and all that stuff. But even so, there is a bit of a pressure cooker because we never spent that much time together. I mean, we literally, as I'm sure many of you did, we spent an entire year together just but imagine if instead of just those 3 people, as we have in the book, 5 more friends come in and all share the same, kibbutz, if you will. And all 8 of them are constantly in each other's faces, having every single meal together. At first freaking out because people are wondering, does anyone maybe have COVID?
Right.
So when the book begins, everyone's wearing a mask and gloves, and the rubber gloves, and everyone's worried about flushing the toilet because we had that worry about the aerosol plume from the toilet. I remember going to restaurants when restaurants opened and just holding it in for hours and being like, I'm not going to have that death plume come out and kill me. So all those things are there. But as you said before, yeah, they're in the background. They're almost comical. I know this was a very serious situation, and all the friends are also freaked out because they have friends back in New York. And they also feel very guilty about being in this beautiful place, while many of them as immigrants came from Queens, neighborhoods like Elmhurst, Jackson Heights. I know those neighborhoods intimately. And, here they are. And here we were in this incredibly beautiful, lush Hudson Valley, away from all the death that was happening. But at the same time, a lot of the friendships in this book begin to be reassessed, as we did, I think, because at this point, all we had was our thoughts, our minds, friendships become reassessed. Old love affairs that never quite were consummated become consummated. People fall in love, people fall out of love. There's betrayal that's discovered among the small group of friends that really moves the plot along and also changes the way everyone thinks about one another. Several kinds of betrayals, romantic, professional, and otherwise. So, I've never written a play before, but there's something really enticing about putting people in the same place and letting them play it out. There's actually some great pandemic art, I would say, included HBO's White Lotus, which used the larger canvas of an entire hotel in Maui, but somewhat similar idea, right? You pack a bunch of people into one place and then you just see what happens.
Gary, I've edited 3 of your books now, and you've written 6. I've loved them all, but this is my favorite of yours, and it is for a couple of reasons. One is it's your most tender. You have a real tenderness to your characters. I'd love you to talk about that and how you've changed as a writer from how you used to think of your characters and how you thought of characters in Our Country Friends.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think when I was a younger man, I was, angry, I would say. I didn't have a wonderful childhood. Assimilation into America wasn't that easy. My parents were and remain, interesting, complicated people. So a lot of what I wrote was very satirical. The book that people may remember, in fact, someone's mentioning in the comments, was Absurdistan, which I recently reread as I was using it for an article. I still love that book very much, and thank you, Mr. Borman, for commenting about it. Yes, I love that book very much, but it is a little bit different from that. I think when I was writing that book, I wanted to satirize the part of the world that I had come from very, very much, and that was the former Soviet Union, which still is a very satirical place. In fact, I haven't even been allowed back into Russia after some of the things I've written about it. The last time I was trying to fly to Moscow, here at JFK Airport, they said your visa's no longer valid, so go home. But I did do a lot of work in sort of satirizing that part of the world. But in the last couple of years, I almost feel like America, I've always thought that Russia would become more and more like America, develop more of a democracy, become less corrupt. But over the last couple of years, it almost felt like the reverse was happening, and America was encountering more Russia-sized problems in its governance, in its all of its systems, and it began to worry me very much. And it's very hard to satirize the part of the world where your 8-year-old son is growing up. It becomes more fraught and difficult. And I guess that's the second part of what I wanted to mention, was that having a child, I think, has really changed things around for me quite a bit, because I never, when I was growing up, I always thought, my work would be my books would be my children. I would never really think of having kids. And the other reason I never really wanted to have kids was, as that Soviet Ashkenazi pessimist, I just didn't think that the future for them would be so bright, especially given the ecological stuff that's happening all over the world, all over our country now. I was in Portland this morning. I just flew in from Portland, and they were talking about the 115-degree weather that they had last summer, and all the elderly people that died. And it was just, oh my God. And I always thought of Portland as like the safest place for climate change, but here we are. So having a child, I think, really kind of took away some of that satire and replaced it with a more, I mean, the book is still hopefully very funny, but it replaced some of those sort of mainly satirical things with a little bit of more compassion, maybe empathy for these characters. I'll give you one example. There's a character named Ed Kim, and he's this Korean dandy. His parents own one of the biggest companies in Korea. And he was influenced by this friend I know, influenced by a bunch of people, but I had this one friend whom I loved. He was this Korean guy, and he had this tick that whenever he met a woman that he was really attracted to, or whenever anyone he was in love with, he would put one of his hands to his ears and talk like this. And we were always making fun of him, like, who are you talking to? Are you talking to a satellite or something? So I decided to put that little tick into the book. And in the book, Ed is in love with this woman named Dee, this Southern essayist, and he's completely in love with her from the moment he meets her. But as he starts talking to her, this thing starts happening. Now, in previous books, I think I would have just played that for laughs and just let it go. In this book, what I try to do is I try to have sort of an omniscient narrator slowly edge its way into everyone's mind. So after he does this, he starts thinking, oh no, I'm doing it again. Now everyone's going to know that I'm in love with her, but I can't stop it. I can't stop doing that, And to me, that's a more empathic way of dealing with things. Not, it's hopefully funny that he keeps doing that, but it's also sad that he knows that he keeps doing that. And like so many things that we do, we just can't stop ourselves.
Yeah, it's written with sort of like one of those things that you love about your friends, rather than one of those things that you want to like just rib them for. You mentioned, this is a book of adult themes, love, friendship, betrayal, family, but there is a child. One of the characters is Nat, as you mentioned. And I would love you to, when I read the book the first time, and then when I was working on it, I kept coming back to Nat and Nat's role in the story. Nat, in some ways, in many ways, represents the future. Obviously, as a child, and I'd love you to talk about how you thought of Nat as you were writing the book, and what Nat brings out in these different characters.
It's interesting, when I thought of Nat, of course, I was also thinking of my own kid who is the same age, and he goes to one of those sort of precocious math and science type schools, the same kind that I went to at Stuyvesant, but it's one for 8-year-olds, and he has all of these friends who are all absolutely brilliant. Maybe their social graces aren't, perfect, but they're always chattering about things that I have no idea what the heck they're talking about, because although I went to a math and science school, I actually am very bad at math. So they're talking about imaginary numbers, and I'm like, what on earth is that? I thought numbers were all real, and 7 plus 7 is 14. It isn't. So having someone like Nat was my way of dealing with kids who are precocious and at the same time a little bit socially, maybe they're advanced intellectually, but socially they have some growing up to do still, and it's this kind of mismatch. And I grew up exactly the same way. I was, by the time I was 8, 9, I was reading Chekhov and stuff like that, but I still didn't know how to play tag on the playground. So all of these, and those are my favorite kind of kids, the ones that are just, they're too smart for their own good. So I really loved writing the character of Nat, but a lot of the adults in the are looking at her with concern, just because there's a pandemic going on. The George Floyd murder happens during the book. All the ecological stuff starts happening during the book. So, one of the characters refers to her as Generation L, standing for last. And this is the scary part for the parents, but also a scary thing for Nat as she grows up, because she's already very cognizant. It's amazing. Even in my kids' school, they have modules on the environment where they talk so openly about all the dangers facing us. So these kids from day one know how to recycle and all this kind of stuff, because that really is their future. But also Nat is in love with this. So Nat is born in China and adopted by Sasha and Masha. And Masha wants her to learn Russian culture, Jewish culture, all this stuff. And Nat, on the other hand, is completely obsessed with this Korean pop band. And she actually wants to learn Korean instead of Russian. And Karen is Korean, Ed is Korean. So, and she also identifies with them because she's also Asian. So this creates all kinds of dynamics for her, where she wants to be, her mother wants her to be one kind of person, she wants to be another. And the book, I think, in the end, I don't want to give away too much, but there's a learning curve, I think, for Masha. Masha is very well-meaning, one of the most well-meaning people I've ever written about. She's a psychiatrist. She used to be in private practice, but now she works with sort of these elderly, insane, poor Russians. But I think the plans that she has for Nat, they may be the best plans, and she's always worried about her, but Nat has to find her own way in the world. And I think this book is a little bit about the beginning of her journey.
There, one of the emotions of the pandemic for many people, those of us who were lucky enough to go away and be someplace safe, was nostalgia for another time, a time before COVID, a nostalgia for a time when we could be together, nostalgia for the lives we had and that had been interrupted. And I find that in the book, that this is one of the colors of the book, of it looking back. Can you share with us some of the stories of the characters and how they're looking back? Because something that I think happened, it certainly happened to me and to many of us during the pandemic, is we reached out to friends who knew us when we were in high school, just like your characters,
right,
and kind of reconnected with those who know us best.
It was incredible. I've never seen anything like this. All of a sudden, it took me a while to figure out Zoom. I'm kind of a Luddite. I never know what I'm doing, but all these emails started coming in from people I hadn't seen since, I don't know, Solomon Schechter, where I went to elementary school, or Stuyvesant, or high school and college. Everyone was sending me Zoom links and saying, happy hour at 5 p.m., let's all get together. People I hadn't seen and heard, hide or hair from in ages. It was it was like having your yearbook from junior high school and college all come to life again. Everyone, all these bald men that I, remembered as being young and spry, and all of them started coming back together, and the women actually all looked wonderful still. Interesting that. But all of that started happening very quickly, and I found myself, so like the characters in the book, I live on this very beautiful road upstate, where as you walk along it, there's sheep on one side, there's this beautiful sheep farm, and then there's this horse farm, and then there's cows. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And it's lovely to walk. And as I walked, I would have my little buds in, and I would be talking to friends I hadn't talked to forever in Los Angeles or Germany. And we began to reminisce, and a lot of those reminiscences made their way into the book. There's one example, a friend of mine who lives in Leipzig in Germany, and we used to, when we were kids, we used to lie in bed separately in our own apartments, and we would talk with each other, and we'd be watching The Simpsons. And this is a line, with a cord, not a cell phone, obviously. And we would say, "Oh my God, look what's happening to a Mo or a Pooh or something," and it was just insane, that connection that we had as we were watching two different screens. It's almost like live commenting on something today, but it was so innocent back then, this idea that we would call each other at 8 o'clock and watch a show together and talk. All these memories were the nostalgia. I mean, nostalgia is often wrong. The memories one has is often wrong, and one often thinks that it was wonderful, and maybe it really wasn't. But whenever there's a pressure point like the last year has been, I think it's the natural instinct is to try to find a different point. Now, as I was writing this book, I wanted the book not to, because we're all living through the pandemic, I didn't want the book to be solely about that. I wanted it to be very much the background, because what I wanted to access more was exactly the emotions you're talking about, the nostalgia, the friendships, all of the things, all of the good things that were heightened. Because I have to say, I mean, obviously, anything that's killed 700,000 people in America is not good. But we have to search for some kind of silver lining here. And I think maybe that silver lining for those of us, the survivors, is the fact that so many of us began to re-ascertain our friendships, our domestic arrangements. So many men, including myself, realized that we needed to do more work in order for the house to function, and that becomes also a subject in the book. All of these different things hopefully will have some positive effects. Otherwise, I don't want I don't want this all to be exactly completely for naught. And hopefully, we'll also produce some decent art in every shape and form.
You write about, the book is set in upstate New York. It's a really gorgeous part of the country. If
it's beautiful.
If people haven't visited there, it's on the Hudson and in that region. And yet in the past, Gary, you've sort of been an urban novelist. You were born in Leningrad. You came to New York City. Your experiences through some of the major cities of the world. But there's some incredibly gorgeous bucolic writing in the book.
Thank you.
So I have sort of two questions. One, I want you to talk about that, but first, there's a ninth character in this book. We've been talking about these 8 friends. There's a ninth character, and his name is Steve. Who is Steve?
Steve is a groundhog who is a major part of the plot, and he wreaks terrible havoc. There's a Steve. We have a groundhog named Steve on our property, so I'm not making him up at all. And Steve is like, I don't know, to put it politically, I think he's like a libertarian, because he kind of believes he doesn't believe in the community very much. It's more about Steve. So he eats all our pine trees. All our trees are dying because he eats their roots nonstop. He eats our vegetables in our vegetable garden. He eats our house. I mean, there's really nothing he doesn't eat. Our porch, we have a beautiful porch that Steve is always nibbling on. And he has all these different houses. He's like, I don't know, he's like Jeff Bezos or something. He has a house by the pine trees that he eats, this big hole. Then he has a hole by the pool. And in the summer, that's sort of his summer palace. And sometimes you walk on the pool deck and he's lying there in this kind of rodent stupor and with his big fat belly up there. And, so he's a real character. But yes, this year we began to discover, since we were up there all the time, we really began to discover that nature was more of a presence in our lives than ever before. And it was beautiful, because I think it was very much silence. The silence was so important. The silence combined sometimes with the squawking of animals. So a friend of mine who just moved up there heard this horrifying noise outside his house and called the local police department and said, "I think there's a murder happening." And they said, "Can you put your cell phone in the direction of the sound?" And he did, and they said, yeah, that's an owl. The police officer said, let me guess, you just moved up here from New York, right? And he said, you'll get used to it. It's okay. But I've been up there for about 12 years, part-time. So I know what an owl sounds like, thankfully. But it was beautiful to see all of the changes happening. The daffodil season come in, the tulips, everything coming and going, the Japanese maples flowering, those beautiful bright red flowers. There was a little baby deer whose mother abandoned her for some reason, and she came and we let her sleep in our vegetable garden. It was sort of very Bambi-like, this poor young deer. And I've never felt so close to the environment and nature before. Like everyone, we started composting, and everyone I know got those apps where you point your phone at some shrub and all of a sudden it lights up and tells you what shrub it is. And, we're like, oh, that's a bird. I see. Okay, that's interesting. All of that stuff started happening. And then the other thing that began happening was everyone started moving up from New York up there. So these post-industrial towns that were always in pretty bad shape, like Kingston, New York, etc., all of a sudden were overrun by hipsters from Brooklyn. I was at one, I was trying to get my license renewed at the DMV, and this woman came out and started screaming, if you're from Brooklyn, go home, because all these Brooklynites were there trying to renew their license. So we felt both at home and slightly as interlopers. And I think one of the sort of conflicts that develops in the book is not between man and nature in the old-fashioned sense, but between new people who have moved here from the city, like Sasha and Masha and Natasha, and some of the locals. And a lot of that has to do with very divergent politics. Most of the people from New York are Democrats and fairly liberal, and a lot of the locals are on the very far right. Some of them have tattoos that look a little suspicious to Sasha and Masha, maybe denote a very far right, almost swastika-like sensibility. So that kind of culture clash is a big part also of what happens. There's this black pickup truck in the book that keeps going back and forth, and people are wondering if they're being surveyed. There's a kind of mystery built through that. But and that's sort of what it was like on the road I live on, where half the houses have Blue Lives Matters flags and the others have hate has no home here signs. And I like to think in a pinch we'll all come together. I don't know. I like Sasha, a lot of trees fall on my property and we have someone chop them into wood, and then we give away that wood as a sign of goodwill. Don't go after the Jewish guy if there's a pogrom or something. But it's a very interesting kind of stuff happening there.
So we have a question from Naomi. Was it difficult to end the book while the pandemic is still ongoing?
It's interesting. I mean, in some ways, yeah, it's difficult. Because I thought that this pandemic would not be a blip. So by November, there was already talk, okay, the vaccines are coming and this is going to end. I had a feeling that it wasn't going to end. But also the other feeling I had was, okay, even if the pandemic dies down, we're living in a world where all of our fiction is going to have to address the fact that terrible things are happening. Some of my favorite parts of the world, I love parts of Australia, like the suburbs of Sydney and beyond, the bush around Sydney, Australia. That's been on fire now several times. California is on fire. Oregon is experiencing heat waves. Actually, I was reading somewhere that the Upper Peninsula of Michigan may be one of the best places, ecologically speaking, for when things begin to fall apart everywhere else. So if you have a summer house in the UP, congratulations, you may be ahead of the curve. But all this stuff is happening. So when we're talking about writing about the pandemic, in a sense, if you project outwards to all of these ecological difficulties and political difficulties that we're, of course, just starting to face, and just social calamities, the fact that, yes, people hate each other to death at this point. I don't think you can write a novel, set in the present time that doesn't quite address these issues, no matter how small or rural or personal you make them. If you were writing from, 1933 to 1945, there was no way if you were writing in Europe, let's say, there's no way you weren't going to cover the fact that all this stuff was happening. You could write a beautiful love affair, you could write a book about children and parents, but always in the background there was going to be the rumblings of what was about to happen or was happening at that from 33 to 45. And I think the world we live in now, unfortunately, also has this kind of feeling. So, if you want to read or write historical fiction, there's something wonderful about that. Obviously, you can go back to another time. But if you're going to write or read about today, I think that has to be sort of priced in, as the investment bankers would say.
Yeah, I even think for historical fiction, one of the historical fiction that sort of stands out and resonates with us today is actually saying something about us today through the lens of the past.
Yes,
yeah, it's finding a story and telling it in a way that reflects back to today.
Absolutely. You wrote The Danish Girl, and today that is such a relevant book as well as movie, because everything that character is facing back in those days is now so important to so many people. So absolutely, yes, good historical fiction, you're right, also will look back toward the present day. And dystopian fiction, Super Sad True Love Story, my novel, was dystopian fiction, but it was really about 2006 when I was writing it, just as Facebook and all these other things were coming to the fore, and I was thinking, yeah, maybe this is good, but again, as the Soviet Ashkenazi pessimist, maybe it won't be that great. And so that's the stuff I focused on. And I feel, in the last few elections, I was at least partially, justified in writing that book.
I remember when we were editing Super Sad True Love Story, we were talking about the version of the phone that people.
Oh, yeah.
The apparat.
The apparat, yeah.
Right, which is a wearable, is what it is.
Wearable, yeah.
It was probably the first wearable in fiction.
Yeah.
And you were telling us that there would be a day in the very near future. This was probably 2007, 2008. First time you and I had a conversation. Yeah, maybe 6.
Yeah.
And you were saying there'd be a day in the not so distant future where everyone would, walk around staring at this small screen that was on their body.
Yeah.
Well, that
it's true. Yeah, that proved very true. The iWatch or whatever is definitely wearable, and I think there's going to be more stuff put in. For the New Yorker magazine, I reviewed the Google Glass, which was a complete calamity. Yeah, but it was it was a glass you wore, and you had a camera built into the glass that was constantly, and there was your eyeglasses vibrated against your earbuds, so that audio was fed in this very scary way. So, the future is going to be very interesting. But this was the only time I've ever written about the present at present.
Yeah, but there is a subplot of tech in our Country Friends, and that is the dating app that Karen invented. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that and what it, what you're trying to say with that piece of the story?
So the app is called True Emotions, and the way it functions is two people take a photo of themselves. TR, the O's all have umlauts on them, so it's pronounced God knows how. True Emotions, something like that. You take a photo of yourself next to another person, and the algorithm doesn't always work, but as you stare at each other's eyes in the app, some people fall in love with one another, and that's what happens. This actor who doesn't care about anyone comes in and falls in love with one of the people that he has invited, that Sasha has invited up, and it's this all-consuming, terrible love, and you can't unlove that person. So in the book, there's a whole class action lawsuit being filed by the spouses of people who have fallen in love with somebody else because they've taken this photo. So I guess the commentary really is about the way these algorithms drive our lives. The way, reading social media, we're able to develop emotions that are so alien to us, but are sort of pre-programmed by these algorithms. And also, I think in another way, it's a statement about the lack of control that we all have now. The way we've outsourced so much of our feelings toward, the way many of us wake up and the first thing we reach for is our phone, and that determines how we're going to feel the entire rest of the day, what our moods are going to be. And it's also helps the plot along, because essentially it works like a love potion. So think of Shakespeare's, Summer's Night Dream, God, with the character of Puck, who provides the love potion, etc. So that's sort of what it does for the book.
There's a dog on TikTok, a little pug, and this dog has about 5 million followers, and this little fat pug. And have you heard of this dog? So
I haven't heard of the pug.
The owner of the dog every morning sets the dog on the sofa upright, like on his back, like kind of like how you describe Steve, like
oh my God,
in pug heaven. And he sits him on the sofa, and if the pug falls over, the 5 million people who watch this every morning, it's like reading their horoscope. They're gonna have a bad day.
Oh my God.
But if the pug stays upright, they're gonna have a good day.
Oh my God.
That's
perfect.
Thing.
That's absolutely perfect. Of course. Yeah. Why not? Why wouldn't 5 million people follow? I mean, a horoscope is sort of exactly that, right?
Right.
Or the groundhog coming up, to determine how long our winter is. So
yeah. I learned that from my amazing niece, Betsy.
It's so great that, I mean, these kids are very helpful. Like my kid is showing me all this stuff. I'm sure he knows about this pug as well.
So we'll go from the very serious topic of pugs on TikTok to Chekhov. We have a question from Diane. When the pandemic started, some friends and I decided to reread Chekhov's stories together. Yeah, good. Even better than baking bread. Can you talk a bit more about the ways that he may have informed your approach to Our Country Friends?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I've been influenced by a lot of Russian writers growing up. Definitely Gogol, whose Dead Souls is very informative to me. That's the ultimate satire of Russia. And if you reread it today, and you superimpose Putin's 21st century Russia on it, it's almost exactly the same thing. It's absolutely shocking how incredibly valid that book has been over almost 3 centuries now. I love Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, a brilliant book, especially very helpful to me as I was trying to figure out my own relationship with my father. So a very important book. Chekhov, though, is to me, I used to read him as a child because my Russian was good enough to comprehend his early stories. I later in college began reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky more in the original. But Chekhov is, his stories are deceptively simple, right? So that a Russian child with, third grade education can sort of read it, but they're deceptively the most complex things ever written. And I think it really is important to read them again and I have no idea how old Diane is, but I think in middle age, they are absolutely more striking than ever because the theme really is one of regret in some ways, not in a bad way, because they put you at ease through their empathy and compassion. Once you enter that Chekhovian, omniscient narrator who kind of hops between all of the different characters and has such sympathy for all of them, you really start to think in exactly the ways that the characters in Our Country Friends think, which is, why didn't X love me? Should I have loved Y instead? Why didn't I send my book out for publication? Why was I so timid? Why did I never stand up to my parents and do what I really wanted to do with my life instead of doing what they wanted me to do with my life? These are all, I think, very huge questions. And I think a lot of Chekhovian protagonists entertain those questions. The stories I kept coming back to over and over are, I'm trying to think of their names in English, About Love, Gooseberries, The Man in the Shell. There's one other I think I'm skipping, but they're all sort of set in country estates where these men get together. They're always men, and they will talk about other men and women, right? So it's almost like the Decameron, right? Which is another influence where all these nobles who have fled, all these aristocrats who have fled the plague in Florence get together at a country estate and talk about other stories, right? So similarly in Chekhov, they all talk about these other people, but they're really talking about themselves. And the more they talk about other people, the more all these men reconsider their own lives and all the places where they've not fulfilled themselves. And at the same time, they're nostalgic, but at the same time, there's this Russian sense of, what are you gonna do? now I'm 49, which for Russian men is, barely alive at this point, right? The life expectancy is not very long. I've lived, I've loved, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, but here we are with a little bit of vodka and bottoms up. And I think that kind of feeling of both nostalgia, regret, understanding, it's a very sweet feeling. It's very funny that, when I mentioned those stories, when I first, I think, was talking about this novel to you, I said something like, it's Chekhov meets The Big Chill.
Right.
And The Big Chill was, strangely enough, a very influential movie when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And when I watched it, I didn't really know English that well. And I certainly didn't have, those characters, I think, were in their 30s and 40s. I didn't have that nostalgia, certainly. I was, I don't know, 9 years old or something like that. But I remember it making a huge impact on me, even though I didn't really understand what this very advanced subject matter was about. But the idea of friends, I think they were University of Michigan graduates getting together after one of them has committed suicide, right? That's the plot. They all get together, and then just like in this book, some fall in love, some are betrayed, etc. So all of that, I think, made a huge impact on me. Even watching it on ABC or whatever the network was, and thinking, I don't know America yet, but if I ever figure America out, I will write something like this.
Speaking of huge influence, I would love you to talk a little bit about your grandmother, who really encouraged you. I think probably the first person to encourage you as a writer. So tell us who she was and how she told you, Gary, you too can be a writer.
She was a journalist in Leningrad. She was originally from what is now Belarusia back in the day, around Vitebsk, where I believe Chagall is from, the Jewish painter Chagall. I think he was from Vitebsk or thereabouts. And so she was an ardent communist because she grew up in just as the revolution was happening. And so she went up to Leningrad, as it was called at the time, and got a job at a newspaper called, I think it was Good Evening Leningrad, was the Вечерний Leningrad. And she got a job there, and I can't remember what her column was, but it was something very agitational. And then she met my grandfather, who wasn't Jewish, which back then was a horrifying shock. But they were both ardent communists. They fell in love. He was an economist. They married. And so when I was a kid, I was 5 years old, and my grandmother was, I think, we're just retiring from her journalism job. She asked me to write a novel, as Jewish Russian grandmothers will, and it was. And she said, I will pay you a piece of cheese for every page you write. And I'm a huge cheese lover. So she made me this little tiny piece of Soviet glowing orange radioactive cheese. And I was just in love with that stuff. So there was an incentive already, So I wrote about 100-page novel for which I was paid 100 pieces of cheese. Even today, part of my advance from Random House is paid in cheese, which is wonderful. Thank you for that. But I needed a subject matter, and the subject matter, as any Soviet kid, I was in love with Lenin. Where we were living in Leningrad, there was this giant statue of Lenin, the biggest statue of Lenin in Leningrad. So my book was called Lenin and His Magical Goose. And it was about Lenin jumping off of the pedestal of the statue, meeting this magical goose, and together they invade Finland and turn it into a socialist country, and then probably aim for Sweden and Norway, and but I remember, the cheese was important, but my grandmother just loved me for it. She just said in Russian, "Tak держать, keep going. This is what you're meant to do." So that made a huge impression on me because she was by far the most educated member of our family, and probably the smartest member of our family. So it made a huge impact on me being both a writer, but also she encouraged me to read more, because she said, if you're ever going to write more stuff about Lenin meeting magical geese, you're going to have to learn more about both Lenin and geese. So that was my literary diet at the time.
What was her name?
Her name was Gaля. So I remember her as Baba Gaля. Baba is short for babushka, which is grandmother. Grandmother Galia, and I had my other grandma was Baba Pola, grandmother Pola, Palina. As I've said, yes, some of my relationships with my parents have been quite fraught, but those two grandmothers were absolutely wonderful. One died in the Soviet Union, didn't come with us. the other came to America and was very much like a parent to me, given that my parents worked very long hours when they came here, as most immigrants do. But the grandmothers were incredibly instrumental to me becoming not only a writer, but hopefully a decent human being.
I just want to tell our audience we're going to wrap up in a few minutes. So if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. Gary, when you came to the US, I remember you telling the story about the first things you wrote in Hebrew school to make friends. Can you share that?
Sure. It was my so I went to Schechter, Solomon Schechter, which is a group of conservative Hebrew day schools around America, and it was not a great place for me personally. I did not speak English or Hebrew because a lot of the kids were from Israel. I spoke the one language nobody really wanted to hear, and it was, the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan's evil empire speech, and the only thing I could do was try to write something that the other kids would love. So I wrote something called the Genorah, which was a takeoff on the Torah, and I wrote it on a scroll. The way, I can't remember what the scribe is called in Hebrew, but I wrote the whole thing down, and Exodus became Sexodus. Everything, Brooke Shields, who was a big star at the time, figured I made her Jewish for this Genorah, and she was sort of like a matriarch, like Sarah is in the actual Torah. And because of that, I made my first friends, because a lot of these kids were like, enough of this Talmud and Torah study. Let's do something fun. So I still had my accent, but when you write, there is no accent, right?
Right.
So all these kids became my friends, and one of them is still a very good friend to this day. So it really kind of saved my life, because before that, there was some bullying, there was some feeling of being alone, of nobody understanding me or my giant fur hat. But the Genorah made things happen for me. So
you learned, that funny goes far.
Funny goes far. I
right?
think it was who was it? One of the authors, a famous author you have, who says funny is money.
Funny is money. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I learned that from a very successful comedic actress.
Yes. Let's just leave it at that. Yeah.
We have just two more. Let's see, a couple more questions. You are known as an expert on and collector of fine watches. It's an unusual fixation for an artist/writer. Can you explain the fascination? And can't quite see your wrist, but I don't see a watch, but there it is. Okay.
Yeah, there it is. So I do collect watches. This is my 40-something hobby. I found it 5 years ago. I wrote a piece in the New Yorker, if anyone's interested. The watch I'm wearing now is interesting. It's a Rolex Gmt from the 1960s. It actually belonged to a NASA administrator who worked in Nixon's White House. So this watch was there when Nixon was falling apart during Watergate. I imagine the guy was in the room at some point. I don't know what it is. I love the ticking of a mechanical watch. A quartz watch kind of goes like this. It's battery powered, but a mechanical watch kind of goes like this. And it's sort of like, it's like my Xanax. When I watch that thing go around, it just relaxes me, and I just become very peaceful. It's my meditation. And when I do meditation, I sometimes stare at my watch, which I know you're not supposed to do. But so it's my geeky little hobby. It's the only hobby I've ever had. I've never collected anything, baseball cards, cars, nothing like that. So it's all.
So there, one more question, and then I'm going to do a wrap up. How did you lose your accent, Gary? Not New York, not Russian.
I can do a Queen's accent, I can still. That's how we talked when we was kids. I always talk to my kid and I say, look at that. It's purple. It's a nice purple color. And he's like, Dad, what are you saying? I'm like, that's how we grew up in, Flushing. But I love the Queen's accent. I think it's really beautiful. The the Russian accent I lost. I worked on it so hard. Who really helped was Neil Diamond. I would listen to all of his songs. To me, he was like this proto-American. And so I remember singing that song, "They Come Into America," and I sang it over and over until it was, "They come into America." Slowly, I lost the accent. But it was really hard because the Russians have a very thick accent. I still don't know half of the, with my parents, we speak in Russian, but whenever I see my parents out in the wild, I don't know what they're saying in English. Where is toilet water? I'm like, what happened there?
Can you share with us what you're working on now?
Nothing. I'm still promoting the book. I have a couple of ideas that, David, I should share with you at some point. But nothing, publicity, thankfully, it takes a few months. So I'm going to keep talking to lovely people like yourselves for a while. Then I'm going to take a month of just pure relaxation around the holidays. I'm going to go to Maui and just sit under a palm tree. I earned it. Yeah, I have a friend who just bought this beautiful house, and I'm just going to sit there with our country friends, the wine, probably chugging it from the bottle, and trying to relax. And then, in the new year, I'll start working on something else. Yeah.
You're going to have your own White Lotus?
I'm going to have my own White Lotus, hopefully without the drama and other things, but I won't reveal for those who haven't watched it. But yeah,
on HBO.
On HBO. Yeah.
We should wrap up, and I want to thank the Detroit Jewish Book Fair. I want to thank Brenda, who introduced us. I also want to thank Gail Fisher, who's on the selection committee. The first, as you heard, Gary wrote this book very quickly, which meant we published it very quickly. And the very first time I spoke about it and told the world that we were publishing it was in late May of this year. And I was on a panel of editors talking about books that we were excited about for the fall. And I introduced our country friends to this group of book people interested in books. And Gail was in that audience, in that virtual audience, and immediately emailed me about our country friends. And it was actually the first feedback we got about the novel. It was the first time I spoke about it, and Gail's email was the first feedback, and that it was the first sign that that what the book is about and how Gary is writing it might resonate with the world. So I was really grateful for Gail.
Thank you.
Gail's email, but Gail's no pushover. She had to read it, so I sent her the manuscript, and thankfully she approved. But I want to thank everyone for watching tonight. Gary, thank you for your time, and Brenda,
thank you
so much for having us.
Thank you. Hope to see you, everyone, in person as soon as this
in person. We would love to be there in person.
Yeah, we would love to be in Detroit in person. Yeah.
Thank you, Gary and David, for being with us and for such a great discussion. And thank all of you at home for joining us also. So this concludes our Book Fair Festival Week, but please join us throughout the year as we continue celebrating our 70 years as the Detroit Jewish Book Fair. On Sunday, November 28th, you can learn about crypto-Jewish life, and on Sunday, December 12th, we have a great presentation about the Julius Rosenwald School and Booker T. Washington and how that affected African-American education in this country. And later in the spring, there are some of your favorite events. We've got book club night coming up and dessert with the authors. So tune into our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair for a full schedule and ways to get involved and ways to purchase Gary's book. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and visit our website. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.